Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. Thank you for joining us. Donald Trump continues to dominate the headlines and dominate BC politics, and we are going to dig into that, as well as discussion of some other items that are still happening in BC politics, despite this big emphasis on the American president. Let's bring in the panel. Allie Blades, Jillian Oliver, Jeff Ferrier here. As always, the Pod Squad to break things down. Thank you for being here. Quick thank you to our sponsors as well. Thanks to Uber for bringing the show to you every week, and thanks to Helijet for supporting us as well. Let us begin, everyone. Donald Trump, week 2, taking over the political agenda. How are we seeing his influence in what we're hearing from the Premier, the speeches, the activity of the ministers, the tone, the tenor of the government? Allie, what's jumping to mind when you think of how Donald Trump has influenced BC politics?
At the core of a lot of the conversation around this, it's very easy to bring up Trump because we don't necessarily have a prime minister that's doing anything on our behalf right now, because he's put government in a situation where they've essentially, we're in a liberal leadership, right? And so as a result, the premiers have really taken center stage for those reasons. Doug Ford's going to call an election very soon, and so all of his political stunts and tactics have pretty much worked in his favor as this quasi prime minister right now, because, well, our prime minister is not doing that work. And so I think like that is really everything, because Doug Ford is now prime minister, and then all of the various jurisdictions have like their own thing that they're trying to advocate. So it's not one cohesive Canadian message. There are elements of what each premier is saying that can be very similar, but no one's really pulling them together. This is very different from what would be in previous times where we're negotiating with the United States. And so that's going to cause some issues, because now, as David Eby says something, well, is that offside of what Danielle Smith is doing? There's like energy conversations, and like there's not one person really bringing us together in a time that we really need to. On that other aspect of this, it's now Trudeau's no longer like public enemy number one in Canadian politics. So we needed a pivot so that premiers and others who are oppositional to him could point fingers and blame somewhere and shift that blame somewhere else. Well, now that easy person to do that with is the new president of the United States. And so now everything is Donald J. Trump's fault, not Justin Trudeau's fault. It's very like, it's weird how that quickly that shifted. And that's,
we always need a villain.
That's politics.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a good point. It's there's always some villain on the horizon. Jeff, I've noticed Doug Ford and David Eby actually are kind of two of the more aggressive and in alignment premiers when it comes to their response, supporting the tariff call, both trying to take American alcohol off of liquor stores. It is interesting to think Doug Ford's doing that to position himself for an election. David Eby's doing it after an election to position himself to look more premier-like in a kind of precarious situation here. But how do you kind of view all of this?
I think they're both doing this because Donald Trump's threat of a 25% tariff on everything represents the biggest challenge British Columbia is facing in a generation. It's a fight that Donald Trump picked, and it's a fight that every political leader in the country with any sense is responded to with a approach that is focused on protecting Canadian workers, Canadian businesses, Canadian jobs, and is focused on keeping the economy strong so that so that we have the revenues coming into government for things like healthcare and education. I think it's a lot of fun to talk about the politics and dissect that. But I think at its core, this is a policy response to a fight that Donald Trump has picked with Canada, and premiers with good sense are pushing back, standing up in the face of this unprecedented action by the United States.
Yeah. Jillian, what's jumped to mind for you the last week as we sort of watched the BC government get buffeted by the random, sometimes comments of the American president that will occur multiple times a day? You know, so they're responding to what he said yesterday, and then he's at the Oval Office saying something randomly new in the middle of the day.
Well, it's hard to believe it's only been a week since Trump's been in office. I think I have to give the premier credit for continuing to come up with new ideas. This week he talked about a number of things, talking about retaliating with critical minerals that the U.S. needs. Also, yesterday talking about charging fees on truckers heading to Alaska. So I think he is thinking creatively, showing that he's got ideas and that he's leaving everything on the table to respond to what is a huge legitimate threat. I think also, right now we're sort of in this waiting period where, we have this potential massive impact. And from EB's perspective, he's using the time to show that he's doing everything that he can to try to prevent it from happening. You see from some other premiers, like kind of the other tack that they're trying to take is to try to de-escalate it. You heard those words from Premier Scott Moe. I think that is obvious that that's not working. That's the tack that Danielle Smith was trying. We saw when Trump initially kind of deferred the tariffs and sent it to a review, she said, thank you. And then the next day he was back to threatening them again. And I think that it's obvious that whether he's using the threats as a negotiating tactic or whether we're actually going to see them come in February 1st or whenever, he decides to do it. I don't think that de-escalation is going to work. And I'm glad to see that we have a leader that's at least putting some concrete things on the table.
Yeah. And talking even more on like a wartime premier, which we discussed last week, that language, never surrender, we'll never give up. This is an economic war. It's kind of fascinating speeches to hear from this premier. It has also led to, I think, a pivot from the government towards natural resource development support, something we haven't seen the NDP be too aggressive on, I think, under the latter stage of John Horgan, the start of David Eby. So I just want to talk a bit about that. Do you think that is a result of the budgetary woes that the government has had and the premier's desire to say he's going to grow the economy, or a response to Trump, or a convenient dovetailing of both? And how interesting is it, Jeff, to see that coming out of the mouth of the premier? I even heard him say LNG at one point. It wasn't even a mistake. David Eby said LNG out loud, which is not something, this premier has said a lot out of. So it's an interesting change in some of his tenor there.
Yeah, the NDP has been behind the scenes and quietly starting to warm up to resources. They did that in the provincial election, where they talked about mining and critical minerals and speeding up permitting approvals for that. But it was certainly not ever the core of the NDP message up until Donald Trump changed everything and changed the entire climate for politics in British Columbia. And so you absolutely see the NDP putting a greater focus on resources, and because they are the single biggest contributor to the strength of BC's economy, and they're the biggest opportunity that we have to grow a more resilient economy. So full steam ahead for mining, please. Full steam ahead for manufacturing, and sure, LNG. And it was interesting this week, maybe we can talk about it more, about the Grand Chief Stuart Phillip coming out after First Nations years and years of pushing back against resource projects, in a moment of candor, saying, well, I support the Northern Gateway pipeline now, and I understand why we did Trans Mountain. And then the next day, after getting lots of phone calls, I'm sure he clarified his statement by saying, I didn't mean any of that at all. But this whole in sum, this whole Trump threat is bringing into much greater focus for the NDP and everyone the importance of natural resource economy to BC.
It is fascinating, Jillian, to watch that debate happening kind of in real time. Like Jeff mentioned, Stuart Phillip, who during my time in politics, 5 or 6 years maybe, just fought the heck out of the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline, really led that nationally, told the Prime Minister he was going to link arms, and Prime Minister Harper opposed this on the ground. He was part of a protest where they had rubber duckies covered in oil in the legislature fountain, and now saying briefly, maybe we got to do these things because Donald Trump's going to do them without us, and we could do them better, and then having to back a little bit away about it. But like a kind of a glimpse into some of the shifting mindset that's occurring, not just from him, but from others maybe on these type of issues as we face off against the American president.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it really struck me as sort of like a reflection of panic that a lot of leaders are feeling right now. They're all getting briefings from their staff and from economists, talking to business leaders about the reality of what these tariffs could mean for communities. And I think that's probably top of mind when he made those comments. But I think, if there is an opportunity with this huge upheaval, it's to think strategically. In the case of the pipelines, there aren't actually those projects on the table. Those project proposals have to come from industry, and they are not proposing to build them because they take a really long time to build, and the rest of the world is rapidly transitioning off fossil fuels. The US is the only one that is ramping up under Trump, and they don't want to buy our energy, according to him. So I think we really need to make sure that we're taking a deep breath before we really double down on anything. California is still on fire. Climate change is still happening, even though Trump's in office. And I think we still, need to be thinking strategically about where the opportunities are, especially if we're looking to diversify our export markets outside of the U.S.
Allie, you touched earlier on the idea of the kind of Trump issue sort of overtaking what could be provincial political failures or criticisms here. And so where do you think natural resource development fits into that when it comes to suddenly realizing that we're in a $9.5 billion deficit and something's got to get us out of it, and that's growing the economy, and look at these projects, but also they happen to produce some fancy things like germanium and that the Americans need, and that kind of convergence of what's really going on here.
And it's a political shift, right, where there's the political pressure from the South to do it, and then a wave of a conservative government federally that one would assume would be a little bit more open to projects like this. So it's the coming together of a lot of political factors. But I mean, this is what the oil and gas industry and the natural resource sector have been fighting for and advocating for so many years. And in another political era, this would have never really happened because we wouldn't have those external pressures that would force the conversation. That's why we saw billions of dollars leave this country and potential investment opportunities. It's why Canada has been constantly criticized for the fact that we're not open for business, and that the investment climate is too unstable for folks to put and trust their money here because of a lot of opposition, and the fact that this is how Trans Mountain ended up being owned by the government versus an external organization. And so now we're in this place where it's like, is it all like a little too late? And to Jillian's point, these projects take a really long time to develop. And yeah, sure, that no one's really proposing it right now because the answer for so long has been no, no, no. And now we might be in a position where they could come back and say, yeah, sure. So maybe not today, Jillian, but maybe very soon these projects might be back on the table from and endorsed by by these big organizations. There's a potential opportunity. We haven't even touched like interprovincial barriers for so many years. Like there's this conversation right now where let's buy more Canadian wine, more BC wine. Well, for the longest time, it's been a huge hassle to get some of our products to Ontario. And now, because of these political pressures, we might have to force that door wide open in order for us to survive as a country first. It's an exciting opportunity, is what it should be seen as, in my opinion.
Interprovincial trade, Jeff, like I've lost track of 17 years of covering politics, listening to premiers meet and then announce tiny little reforms to interprovincial trade, TILMA, and all these agreements. Like, is that a solvable problem in this climate when it hasn't been before? How real of an issue is that, and is it going to be finally tackled by Trump, or why have we never figured it out before, do you think?
I think it's a real issue. I think some provinces are making strides on it. I think we have in Canada a culture on permitting and authorizations and negotiations of let's draw this out as long as we possibly can so that we can extract maximum value for whoever we're negotiating for. And there's no urgency, and there's no reason to make things happen quickly. I think Trump's tariff threat and the potential impact on our country and our economy is like a bucket of ice water over the heads of folks and say, come on, let's get on with it. Let's solve this. It's important. We need to be strong. Let's recognize that one of the reasons why the president of the United States is targeting Canada with these economic measures is that he sees it as a weakness. And in his way of negotiating, he wants to take advantage of weakness to get something that he wants out of that. And we haven't done those things, haven't made those foundational moves, haven't moved projects forward as quickly as we have, is making us vulnerable. I do want to talk a little bit about, just really briefly, about the interprovincial dynamics that I think are interesting. And it's Danielle Smith and Scott Moe and their efforts to, let's negotiate with the states. If this were 1972, every other premier would be on Team Canada. They'd be on Team Soviet Union. And and John Rustad here, where he's trying to get share of voice in the media by saying similar things. It's like responding to someone punching you in the face by sending them a thank you note and expect they're going to do things differently. I would like to see, in addition to the interprovincial trade fixed, I'd like to see some interprovincial cooperation in fighting Trump.
What happens if Trump doesn't follow through with the tariffs to David Eby, do you think? Like, let's say that it doesn't end up being this massive thing, that we get a different trade deal or we get more threats or whatever. Can he just snap back to a different political agenda, or does he need to keep riding this for a little? It seems like it woke the NDP government up, and now they got a purpose, and they're out there fighting, and it's incredible speeches. What does he do if it doesn't go through?
It's hard to imagine even if the tariffs don't get implemented right away, that Trump will stop threatening them and stop being antagonistic. Or, if we go into more of what happened last time, a renegotiation of CUSMA, that takes a long time. So it'll be kind of up in the air. So I think if it's, not the worst case scenario that we're all kind of operating under right now, I think that this does underscore, a larger global trend towards protectionism that is happening everywhere, that I think in BC we've kind of been trying to pretend hasn't been happening. And it is a good wake-up call regardless to think about economic resilience, to think about trade diversification, and to think about strengthening our local economy, whether that's manufacturing, the things that we produce here, or, the way that we are consuming goods. I think we're overdue for that kind of a cohesive, forward-looking economic strategy. And I think that, there's probably, in that scenario where we don't have the 25% tariffs, there's a middle ground where Eby can pivot, maybe to adopt some more of his agenda that he talked about during the election, which will be more relevant, but also to pivot to, the very apparent and real kind of global economic reality that we're in.
Yeah. What do you think of that, Allie? Like, I feel like if this doesn't end up being tariffs and Eby pivots back to his election platform, there wasn't really a lot in there that was spectacular. Maybe he can afford the affordability rebate, but probably not.
It was all spectacular, Rob.
It was so spectacular we can't even remember it. What does he do in that? And can he just go back and just kind of resume where he was, do you think?
Can you go back to what it was during the election? Not really. The conversation has now shifted. The federal landscape has shifted, which also affects us as well. We saw in the mandate letters and in everything that's coming out of the NDP government right now, it's cut everywhere, right? And that's not it's cut, but then we're also not really figuring out how we build new good paying jobs in BC either. And so it's a new world. And I don't say this very often, but I feel for David Eby, because as premier, he's kind of gone through a million iterations of what this province looks like through pandemic recovery, and now with the North American political landscape shifting as well. But I will say this. Let's leave this on a somewhat lighthearted note, because this is all very doom and gloom. What I found most interesting was David Eby this week giving travel advice of do not go to the United States. Let's show them. And I'm like, dude, no one can afford to go to Disneyland anyways. Like, the Canadian dollar is so it's so messed up that your $30 churro at Disneyland is $60 Canadian. So that's not going to show them. We really need to be serious and have a conversation about how we really bring in better investment into this province.
Well, at least he's given us free rein to avoid drinking Lone Star in Old Milwaukee. By suggesting we don't have American alcohol.
But that Kentucky bourbon, I need that. That's not going to be good.
That's going to be a big sacrifice. You're right.
Yeah. All right. We will leave it there. We got some more coming up in the audio podcast version of the show. So make sure you subscribe to that. Some other topics to come up with. Jillian, Jeff, and Allie, thank you for being here. And thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.